Hi guys, I just recently did my first Watercool build and it was a lot of fun and it was a lot of struggle. Now I learned almost everything from watching videos like Jay's 2 Cents or Designs by IFR. And even though those videos are great, they didn't quite answer every question I had. So I'm making a video to try to answer all those questions that came up along the way that I struggled with. And if this video helps out one person and answers just one question for one person, then I'm glad I made the video. If you guys like it, leave a thumbs up or comment below if you have any more questions and maybe I could do another video. Alright guys, thanks for watching.
Alright, starting it out, we got our first tip: buy the right components. I'm not going to go too in depth. There's other videos that go more in depth on what components to buy, but I will say you do need a pump and you do need a reservoir. I got a 250 size from EK. I got everything from EK. Love the products. You're gonna need a CPU water block, and you might even want a GPU water block. You're definitely gonna need at least one radiator. You might need two, depending on your cooling needs, and you just want to make sure that you definitely get the right sizes. You don't want to go too big. If you go too big, you might run out of room, just like I did in this clip right here. If you could see, I had the layout designed and everything in SketchUp, another great program to help you figure out your designs and layouts, but I have no room. The fittings are really close together. I have absolutely no room to put my hands in there, to get fittings in there, to get tubes in there, just like no room at all to work. So you want to go to EK's website. They actually have a great tool to help you figure out what sizes are good for your radiators and what reservoirs are good for your case, and they have everything all figured out in some configurator on their website. Highly recommend to go. And this brings us to our next tip, which is get the right fittings. I highly recommend you get compression fittings as opposed to barbs. Compression fittings just hold the tube a lot better, and they're just a lot better for first-time users. And once you have all your compression fittings, even if you have your entire layout all designed, I can't recommend enough to get extra 90-degree fittings. They let you approach your components from angles too tight for bent tubes. And right here you see a rotary or even a double rotary 45-degree angle. Pretty much they allow you to rotate your fittings to meet the ends of your tube bends, and they offer forgiveness. I also highly recommend you get maybe one or two extensions, and they offer different sizes. You might want to pick up a few different ones just to be safe. And our next fitting is kind of a quick tip. If you want a drain valve, or if you want to connect your pump directly to your reservoir without any tubing, and you want to bridge that gap without the tubes, you need a male-to-male extender fitting, and it's good for connecting any female components together, and it's really a must-buy. And if you do want to connect your pump and res together, all you do is you take the male-to-male and you plug it in the bottom of your reservoir, or hell, you could even plug it in the top of your reservoir. It doesn't really matter. But what does matter is if you do have an EK reservoir, you do have to get the extender fitting it comes with, because the ports are recessed. So definitely make sure you put that on there first. And if you do want to end up doing that drain valve, which I really recommend you do one, you're gonna need to drain it at some point. Get a T-splitter, which I show right there, and get a ball valve. Both two fittings you're gonna need, and I'll actually go into it later how to set that up. Now, some other stuff you're gonna need is something to kill those microbes in that water, man. You don't want any microbes growing. PT Nuke is the one a lot of people recommend. Highly suggest to get some PT Nuke. And if you want your tubes to have some color, you're going to either need some dye or some colored tubes. I ended up getting some Bits Power Deep Red dye, which actually worked out great. You're also going to need some distilled water, which I highly recommend over the pre-made stuff. And last but not least of the fittings and components you need, you're gonna need some tubing. I really recommend Thermaltix. It's awesome, it's clear. I've tried that one, I've tried all the other brands. I love it. It's on Amazon and it's cheap. Highly recommend. And good news for tip 3, get all the right tools. Most of the purchasing is probably done. You should have a lot of this. You're gonna need a drill, a level, a tape measure, a box cutter, definitely a screwdriver. There is this little piece here. I'm going to get into that later. It's for jumping the battery. You're also going to need an Allen wrench. It should come in most of the EK stuff that they're going to send you. I do recommend maybe a file. It's not necessary. Kind of do recommend it, but it brings us to the important stuff for cutting the pipes. A regular old pipe cutter is great, makes clean cuts. A hacksaw will do the job if that's what you have, but it does not make the cleanest cuts, which brings me to my number one recommendation, a pipe cutter that comes in a kit. I don't know what they're called, but they spin around and they just make the most super clean cuts. Highly, highly recommend to get one of those kits. It'll come in there. And guys, I cannot recommend getting one of those kits enough. It is the number one thing I recommend out of everything. Those mandrels you see right there and the silicone insert, it comes with all that. It comes with a little chamfer to clean the edges. I'm going to get into a lot of that later and explain it when it comes to the tube bending. But that kit by Thermaltake, it rocks. It's a little expensive. Highly recommend it. Get some sandpaper too. You're going to need it. And then you're also going to need a heat gun. You're also going to need some sockets, some 4mm sockets to do your GPU. If you want to do some drilling in metal, you're going to need a step drill. And if you don't have one of those, you could also get just a regular titanium drill bit. That's what I ended up using to drill through metal in my case. Highly recommend to get all of that stuff. And for the installation, tip 4, installing the pump correctly. I recommend you to get the pumps that come on stands. It's a lot easier. Or if you want to mount it, some cases you can just mount directly into it. If not, you're going to get a template to do the drilling into the case. You see the template here, you just place it on your case and you drill where you see the little holes. You're going to need a 4mm drill bit, titanium ended. And when you're doing the drilling, you're going to want to put 2 hands on the drill and push firm, not hard, but firm. And the most important point is drill slowly, 1/4 to 1/2 speed drill. Do not drill full speed or you will end up breaking the drill bit just like I did here. I got impatient and I drilled fast. And another tip, you might want to get a wooden block and put it behind the metal or you will shear the metal just like I did right there. I ignored the guy's tip. I drilled fast and didn't use a wood block. Now the next tip 5 is if you want to install the fans on the front of the case or on the back of the radiator. Now the screws that the EK radiator came with aren't very long, so unless you have some really long screws, you're not just going to be able to screw them all in from the back like normal. You're going to have to alternate front and back, and do not go horizontal. You're going to have to go crisscross because the radiator, I mean, that's just so thick right there. So you're going to have to go through the front and back, and when you're in the front, do not go from the top left to the top right. Go from the top left to the bottom right in like an X fashion like that, and then go to the back and do another screw. Just alternate. All right, and for tip 6, we are installing the CPU water block. Now these are EK's instructions, so if you don't have an EK, you might want to just get an idea by watching. But if you did get an EK, it comes with really cool instructions already, but there's a couple pointers might just help you along the way. It comes with a rubber gasket and a metal bracket. And if you look there, you could see the metal bracket, it has some raised edges. It's what they call the rib side. Now, you want to make sure the rib side is facing away from the motherboard, or the side with the raised edges away from the motherboard. Okay, now you have screws. Now, the ones you see here are smooth. Those are for the 1150s motherboards, and if you have one of those, then you're going to use those smooth ones. Now if you have a 2011, you're going to want these screws right here. You could see they have like little raised edges or lines. Once again, those are for the 2011 motherboards. I have an 1150, so I'm going to use the water block the way it came. They sent it to me ready to go for the 1150. Now I've heard that you can actually use it the way it's set up for both the 2011 and the 1150, but if I was you and I had the 2011, I would change out the jet plates inside, do it like they recommend, and go ahead and switch it out. Okay, and I skipped ahead here, went ahead and installed it, but I will tell you how I did it. Okay, so you pretty much just hold it there, but you have to use the plastic washers that they gave you. You have to put them down to protect your motherboard. and you put it down in front of each one of those silver screws. Make sure you use those. Now, the instructions also tell you you have to take out the motherboard from the case, but you don't have to do that. You can just stand up and push it down right here. You just do one screw at a time. You just hold down the rubber gasket and the metal bracket, and you just kind of push on it and install one screw at a time. Now, it's a really important tip that you do not install that screw all the way to try to hold that rubber for you. And that's what I did. I figured it would hold it in place. Let me go ahead and screw it all the way down, but don't do that. Make sure that you do small turns. So instead of screwing it in all the way, just do a quarter turn or a half a turn, and you do that in a crisscrossing X pattern, because if you don't do it in the X pattern, top left to bottom right, it'll end up bowing out on you. And this brings us to tip 7, how to do the GPU water block. It's basically unscrewing a lot of screws, but it's really easy. I don't want anybody to get discouraged from doing this. Just start unscrewing all the screws, but the key here is to be organized. Make sure you get some painter's cup or Altoid tin and start organizing it, because there's lots of different screws you're going to need to keep track of. And the reason you want to keep track of it is in case you ever want to sell this or just put it back together, you're going to need to know where everything went, and it's just going to be so much easier if you keep track and organize it. I mean, I just dump them in there, each one in a different one, and then label them out. I write out what each of them was, and then when I put them in bags later, I write on the little bags. Make sure, though, you get a tiny, 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 tiny little Phillips head screwdriver. I mean, as small as you think you need it. Go smaller, because look at those screws. I mean, they are super tiny. Now, for 99% of all the screws you see here in this painter's tray, the tiny little Phillips head screwdriver, that'll be enough for most of them. But there's one more tool you're going to need, and I didn't mention it in the beginning. I'm sorry. You're going to need a 4mm socket, and I bought here a little ratchet set to go with it, but you don't need it. Just that little 4mm socket will do the trick. Now, once you're done removing all of the little screws or the little sockets, you could just take the back plate right off, and you're almost done. You just have to take out the 4 screws on the side. I think it's 2 sets. Then you could start separating the PCB from the shroud. Now, make sure there's 2 little wires that you don't separate it all the way, because you got to unplug those 2 little wires, so don't just yank it off. Once you're done unplugging the wires and taking the shroud off, you will see the thermal pads that were on there before. I just went ahead and took those off, and I ended up using only the ones that were included in the set. You will have to cut some of those up to fit, and there's some pretty good instructions that they include, and there's also some other videos that go even more in depth on this. But one little tip is, it's also common sense, is to organize and separate the screws. It pretty much goes short, medium, long, and then they're M3s. I just put those back into the painter's tray that is now empty, just for organization, as that really helps. And once you're all done putting the thermal pads on, it should pretty much look just like this. You can even pause it for a minute and check it out. But it was pretty easy, just cutting the strips and laying them all out. Make sure you also get the thermal paste on. I did not do the star. I just kind of spread it all around. That's just a technique I've always used. Just make sure it's on there nice and evenly. And then it's okay if the thermal pads are a little thick up on the top right there, or if it even sticks over a little bit, because if you look at the back of the plate, you could see that it has bigger, thicker indentions. So they really want you to make good contact in those deep little rivets right there for the VRAM modules, I believe it is. Just make sure that has good contact. And that brings us to our next tip, tip 8, which is how to make a custom backplate. This one isn't mandatory, but if you do want to do it, you're going to need a sheet of acrylic from like Lowe's or somewhere, and you're going to need an acrylic cutter. It's pretty much like an X-Acto knife. It's helpful to put out some tape to help you make some straight lines, because it's actually really hard to keep it straight. You do want to make some short, slow cuts first, and then once you have a little bit of a line or a guide, that's when you can start going a little bit harder and faster. And once you're finished with the cutting, all you got to do is paint it and then use some double-sided tape to tape it down. However, just really make sure you go at least 50% deep into the acrylic with the knife, and do not try to break it early or you'll kind of chip it like I did in the corner. And for our next tip, tip 9, setting up a drain port, I do suggest to do this. You're going to need a ball valve connected to a male-to-male, which you then connect to a T-splitter. Then you just need another male-to-male on the other end of the T-splitter and set that up to your pump or reservoir. And we are already on to our next tip, tip 10, how to measure and bend the tubes. Now, this is the one where most people struggle with, most people fear. But the easiest way to do it is to get your measuring tape out and make sure that you are measuring from the center of the tube, not the top and not the bottom, but the center. So you just measure from the center of the fitting to where you want your bend to go. Make sure that the tape measure is level and on the same plane as where your tubes will sit. Once you do that, you just move over to your mandrels, and this is where these mandrels really come into use. I highly recommend, can't recommend it enough that you use these. It made my life so much easier. But all I did was mark where on the tape measure I wanted the turn, and then I marked it on the mandrel. And then from there, you could even mark it again on a piece of wood or something that you set your mandrel up onto. I actually nailed it into the piece of wood so that it wouldn't budge and I could use it for measurements. At that point, I just used my silicone tube insert and I just put that into the tube. Make sure you put it farther than you think it needs to go. Now, with the heat gun on low settings, all you want to do is rotate the tube, and you want to just keep it constantly moving. And you only need to heat it about an inch or two past the maximum point of the bend. You don't need to go too far. And once it starts getting a little bendy under its own weight, you can even push it a little to see if it's bending. Heat it for about 5 or 6 more seconds, then bring it over to the mandrel and just push it into the mandrel itself with some firm pressure. And just keep pushing and then hold it for about maybe 20 seconds and it'll start to cool down. And you can even speed up the cooling process by squirting some water on it or even walking it over to a sink or something and running some water onto it. And for our next tip, tip 11, this one I couldn't find a whole lot of information on, but I hope this helps you out. It's prepping the tubes for the fittings. And it's a pretty crucial step depending on what fittings you get, but I recommend you get the kit, and if you don't have the kit, you can do it with sandpaper, some rough grit sandpaper, or even if you have a file like you see here in this video, those will work. And you pretty much just want to get the outside edges with that file until you start to see like a 45-degree slope along the outside edges. And then once you're done doing that, you have to hit it with some fine sandpaper. Now, even though that way works, it's definitely the harder way. The easier way to do it is to use the chamfer in the kit. Here you could see the tube before the chamfer. And now here we're doing the chamfer, and you do it for about maybe 15 or 20 seconds with some firm pressure. And how do you know that you've done it for long enough? Well, you pretty much just do it for about 20 seconds, but you can look at this image here. If it looks like this, you're pretty much about done, and that's all you gotta really do before you put it in the fitting. That and hitting it with some fine sandpaper, but pretty much you're finished. Now I'm going to show you an example of how to get it in the fitting, but when you're actually doing it, the fitting should already be installed on the components. But here I want to show you how easy it is to get it into one of the EK fittings. I really like the EK fittings. You can actually feel it like slide in and just like you can feel it pop or like click. You could just tell it's going. But with the Bits Power ones, like you see here, like you really have to push like really hard. And even when you're pushing really hard, I never really felt it click. So I definitely recommend EKs. It's a preference thing. Now remember, you're supposed to have all the fittings on the components, but for the other end, you just slide on the O-ring and the other end of the compression ring and slide it down, and you're good to go. Alright guys, and we are almost finished. All we have left are some finishing touches, which I'm breaking up into 3 stages. The first is filling the reservoir. If you want, you can use a tube or like a squeeze bottle. You can use a compression fitting connected to a soft tubing, or you can even use a beer bong. You just need to get the water into the top of the reservoir. And for stage 2, it's protecting your components, usually done by putting down plastic wrap or mainly paper towels. But pretty much you do not want to get any water on anything, and if you do, as long as there's no power going to it, you should be okay. But make sure you just really get paper towels crammed up into every corner in there. And that brings us to our last stage, which is performing a leak test by jumping the power supply. But don't forget, guys, don't let your reservoir get too low in liquid. Stop jumping it and let it refill. Now, the best way to jump it is if your battery or power supply came with a little black jumper. That takes all the thought out of it. That thing's great. But if you don't have one of those, you can use a paper clip, and all you do is straighten out the paper clip. Just look for the green and black wires and just stick it down in there. It's pretty easy, but what do you do if all of your wires are black? Well, in that case, take a look at this image I provide and just make sure you put it in the third and fourth port down on the clip side, and you should be good to go. So what do you do if you followed all the directions but your pump's just not moving the water? Well, there's a couple things you could do. The first is just taking your case and kind of rocking it back and forth slowly, not really shaking the crap out of it, because it's got some air bubbles that are caught in there. I even turned mine upside down and shook it around and let all those air bubbles out. And if that doesn't work, you need to know if your pump is even on. And the best way to know if it's on is either trying to listen to it, or even better, putting your hand underneath it and feeling it. It's the only way I was able to know that my pump was on. I recommend that if you have a PWM that you do not plug the pump control into the motherboard, because when I did that, I only had 30% power, and once I unplugged it, I had 100% power, although I do know some people will say the opposite, but in my case, once I unplugged it, I got 100% power, which totally fixed my problem. Now, once there is power going to the motherboard, after the leak test is complete, you do want to plug it back in. And the final tip is enjoy your work.